Shalom, everyone. Lila Tov. It's good to see you tonight. We are in Daniel, thanks to the auspices of Rod Bryant and NETIV. And hopefully you will look to subscribe or become a part of the family if you're not, and help us to grow. We were in Daniel. This is the book that I've used for years. And I use the word years because it was created in 1979. It was the very first art scroll book that ever came out. And so back then, I was already searching for Jewish sources of writings and commentaries. And so this one was the first one. And so far, I've taught it 4 different times. This is the 5th time through, actually. I went back and counted. This is my 5th time through. And I will tell you, since this was written in 1979, a whole lot of things have changed in my mind, and you're going to hear some of them tonight. In fact, I want to leave you with some questions as we go through tonight that you can look at, because next week it will be part 2 of this section. This is Daniel chapter 8, part 1. And it's the traditional reading of the Daniel that was written by the Rashis and the Sedigions and the Rambams and all of them. So that's the source that I originally used. Tonight, I'm going to tell you that I've used lots of sources. I continually go to the web now that the web is here, and I'm constantly looking for sources. And so I find bits and pieces and I add them to it. One of the sources that I'm using is the Book of Enoch. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch is a apocrypha book. It was written about 200 or 300 BC. Now, Daniel was written about 600 BC, so this is 300 years later. But when this book is finally published, or when this scroll was finally published, there was a great deal of searching for understandings, what was going on. Israel was in trouble. They were under the Greeks. They were tormented to no end. And all through history, we find the time that the Jews reach this point where they really are looking to find out when the Messiah is coming. Well, Enoch was published. Enoch is written obviously long after Enoch had lived on this earth, because the Enoch they're talking about is the Enoch that was the father of Methuselah. So a lot of our story comes from the book of Genesis. But I want you to understand, a lot of it comes. If you read your Christian Bible, you've read much of the book of Enoch, because you see, the book of Enoch is quoted constantly in the New Testament. It's even quoted in the Old Testament, if you want to call the Tanakh an Old Testament. Enoch's first section is called the Watchers, and the Watchers talks about angels. I don't mean to get too far into this, but I wanted you to understand, he deals a lot with angels. He deals a lot with the Messiah. In fact, what got him banned from the Jewish understanding is the fact that he believed he knew when the Messiah would be born and where he would be born. And so that was heretical. So therefore, it never made it into the scriptures. And that was back in the 3rd century AD. So there was a lot of things going on, but it dealt with the angels that were copulating with the women on this planet, creating Nephilim, the giants. There were also stories in here about the fact that Enoch actually was a messenger from God. He was sent to the angels, talking to them and explaining to them what was going to happen, and that they would be punished and what it would look like. And so all of that is in the book of Enoch. So it's several sections. The first Enoch is dealing with the Watchers. 2nd, 3rd, 4th deals with periods later on. And in that, I've grabbed some of the information that's there. And I stuck it in my mind just to hang on to it, because you never know when you're going to need trivia questions. But as I'm going through the lesson, I want you to understand Well, let's go first to the last verse of Daniel chapter 8. So would you look in there? And we're at the last verse, verse number 26. Okay. Verse 26 begins, the vision of the nightfall and the morning. And it's written Arev Boker. In other words, there's no in between. It goes from nightfall to morning quickly, which has been spoken is true. As for you, obscure the vision. So what we're about to read tonight is an obscured vision. In other words, it was never meant to be clear. Clarity would come as time passed. That was the understanding. Clarity would come as the time passed, because it didn't belong for those days. It belonged long days after. So we have to understand that what we're reading was not made clear to Daniel, although Daniel knew it, but Daniel wasn't allowed to share it, just like he didn't share all of what he saw in Daniel chapter 7, just as he won't share all that he knows in chapter 12. Much of the text that we're going to be reading is text that was put together or understood in commentaries by the Rashi, by Rambam, by the Senagion, by a lot of characters who lived in the 9th, 10th, 12th century. That's where the Daniel that I was reading came from. But you and I both know that it didn't end when they thought it would. Well, actually, some of you know, because I sent you a copy of the years that Rashi had figured out, and we'll go through that as we get there. But understand that what we're reading is not totally clear, and that's why I'm going to give you some questions to think about. Because I hope you're pondering what's going on. I hope that there are things in here that are more than curiosities to you. There are things that you would like to know. And maybe you can help me understand exactly what we're talking about. Okay, let's go back to the first verse in this whole story. So in chapter 8, verse 1, it begins by saying, in the 3rd year of Belshazzar's reign. Now, the 3rd year of his reign is his last year. Now, the last year was under a great deal of stress because the Persians and the Medias were actually on the doorstep. And remember, the story of Belshazzar's end came because he thought he had already beat the two nations back, when in actuality they just appeared to disappear, and they dammed up the river and came under the river into the city. So this is the 3rd year that this is happening. Now, Daniel gets this vision, and notice it's a vision that he's actually seeing. It appears to me, I, Daniel, after that which had appeared to me at first. So something appeared to him at first. So he doesn't tell us what that is. First question, what is he talking about? He goes on to say in our story, goes on to say, verse 2, I saw in the vision when I saw I was in Shushan, the capital, which is in the province of Elam. Problem. Shushan wasn't a city then. Shushan was a fortress. In fact, it wasn't even going to be the capital city of the Persian Empire until the days of Esther and Ahasuerus. Up until then, the Persepolis was actually the capital of the Persian Empire. So Darius the Mede made the capital the city of Babylon. When he was on his untimely death, Cyrus the Persian took the capital back to Iran, or Persepolis, and that's where the capital was. Shushan will become important to Daniel because Shushan, that will be where he will die. You see, he is in Shushan serving Esther. He is one of her courtiers at that point in time. He'll be killed by Haman trying to deliver a message to Mordecai. Now, if you go to Persia, you will find, or you go to Iran, you will find the grave of Daniel there, the cave in which he's buried. So we know Daniel died there. Only his name on the stone will be Hatat. Hatat. You see, he was given a new name by the Persians. So he is no longer Belshazzar. He was now Hatat. But he still went by the name of Daniel. So Shushan is the city where he is going to eventually be and where he will eventually die. But in the course of time, the thing that's important is the fact that it wasn't the capital city at that particular point in time. It would be another 40 years before it would become the capital city. And the reason it became the capital city is because Ahasuerus had a throne made for him out of glass and gold. And this chair was so fragile that he built his palace around it. And the fortress was then extended around the palace. So that's where he will end up. But that's the story that we're starting with. In verse 2, it goes on to say, I saw in the vision that I was at the Eloi stream. Now, the Sadia Gaon from Egypt, he said there was no such thing as a river called Eloi. He simply said it was a stream, but it may not have been a stream at all. It may have been just simply a highway. But we understand from Jewish sources that if the prophet receives his message at the temple or in the temple area, if you're outside the country like Ezekiel was, he received it by a river, a place of clean water. And so the Jewish nation identifies the Eloi as a river that was flowing in the country of Persia at that particular point in time. Now he raised his eyes and he looked, and behold, a ram is standing before the stream. And then it goes on to say, and it has horns. The horns are high, but one is higher than the other. And the higher one is coming up last. Now I saw the ram goring westward, northward, southward, and no beast could stand before it, nor could anyone rescue from its hand. It did as it pleased, and it grew. Now, later on in verse 20, we're going to find out that he's talking about Persia. The character that he's really talking about is the character called Darius, the Persian. Because you see, Darius the Persian will be the one who will find himself regrettably facing off with Alexander the Great. And Darius, who is Esther's son, had moved the empire, had caused it to grow. But he only caused it to grow in 3 directions as you look at this whole story. But it gives us some specifics that we need to understand. So it's by a stream or by a river. One of the things that I might also add is the word for ram, because I'm going to ask you another simple question. In Daniel chapter 7, we saw Persia as being a bear. We saw Greece as being a leopard. So why does he change animals? Why do we now have a ram, and why do we now have a goat, a he-goat? What caused him to change? That's a question that I've asked myself all the way through every time I've studied this. I think I have an answer this time, but I'm not going to share it till next week because I want you to think about it. I want you to ponder this whole idea. But anyway, so he moves against the Greeks. In fact, he gets all the way into the Macedonian area. And I don't know if you remember the Peloponnesian Wars, if you remember Thermopylae, where the 300 Spartans stood against the Persian army. That whole idea of causing the Greeks to gather together. Eventually, the Greeks under Philip of Macedonia created an army and marched out against Persia, crossing that same Dardanelles, that same straits, and moved back and started to push against the Persians. Philip died. Alexander the Great took over. And we know what happened with Alexander the Great, how he moved across the country. Well, the story goes on. If I'm looking at verse 5, it says, I was contemplating this, and behold, a he-goat comes from the west across the surface of the entire earth, but not touching the ground. And the he-goat had a conspicuous horn between its eyes. Well, it came up to the two-horned ram that it had been seen standing by the stream, and it ran at it with a fury as of its might. Now, again, horns represent power. Represent power. So we're talking about two powerful groups. The ram had two horns because it represented Media-Persia Empire. Media was the smaller of the horn. Persia was the larger of the horn. Greece, on the other hand, it was a single horn between the eyes. We understand that Greece really only goes as far as Alexander can go. With Alexander's death, and he will die from a fever that he develops, which cuts short everything that he's planned and whatever he was about to do. So Alexander dies, and he'll be replaced. But in our story right now, he's charging across, and it says from the end of the earth. We can't take the end of the earth by saying it was all the way from the United States all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. We can't even go from the coast of Spain. Our distance is really from Macedonia, from Greece. But if we look back at the historical period, there wasn't such a thing as nations that were farther west at that point in time. So this is about something that's going to happen very close. And so he moves across the land very quickly. He hops and skips, according to the real literal of the Hebrew. And so the ram had no strength to stand before it. The goat threw it to the ground, and he trampled it. Darius the Persian will die, but he won't die because Alexander runs a sword through him. He is going to die because the satraps that were under him, or the generals that were under him, capture him and kill him and deliver his dead body to Alexander, saying, "We quit, you win." And so he captures all the land that the Persians had owned all the way through. And that's when he had gone all the way to the Indus River. Now, he didn't cross the Indus River because there was something on the other side that scared him to death. In fact, he tried twice, but he never succeeded. And that was the elephants. You see, the Indian people were using elephants like tanks against the horses. And so Alexander couldn't go any farther. So he went back to Babylon, where he set up his kingdom there. But before he goes back to Babylon, he takes 80,000 of his men and tells them to marry Persian women. Well, why does he want them to marry Persian women? Because he wants to create an army of Greek Persians, because they would be the stronger fighters. He's creating a hybrid, a super race, if you will. And that's what he was about to do, except for the fact that he ends up dying of a fever at the age of 33. And so the plan falls apart. And as we read on, it says, then the he-goat grew greatly. And this is verse 8. At its mightiest, the great horn was broken at the age of 33. And the semblance of four horns came up in its place. Now, remember, when we were looking at in Daniel 7, it was a leopard and it had four heads on the leopard. So we're getting the same concept here, or the same idea, or apparently the same idea. It says, but it was pointing towards the four directions of the heavens. Again, he's back in Babylon. Now, if he's in Babylon, then that means that there was land north of him that belonged to Alexander. There was land south, east, and west. So technically, these generals will divide up the land and create 4 different smaller kingdoms in different areas. We're most familiar with the Seleucid because that's the area with Antiochus Epiphanes, who's came against the Jews and created what we call Hanukkah. Then we also recognize Egypt because that's the Ptolemies, and we see them in our stories as we go through this understandings. So those two are the ones that are most common. One is the furthest out into Persia. He immediately is destroyed by the Seleucid, and the other one was in Macedonia, which was there for quite a while. But anyway, as our story goes on, he says, out of one of them came forth one little horn, which grew exceedingly southward and eastward and toward the coveted land. So one of the horns is now going to eventually, another horn, a little horn, will come out of it. Now, as the art scroll says, as the art scroll believes, Rashi and the rest of them say what we're talking about is a character called Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, the Jews had a different name for him. Epiphanes is to be a great soul. They chose to refer to him as a piece of toilet. But anyway, that's beside the point. And the words are very similar, but I'm not going to go there. So anyway, he goes towards 2 directions and towards the Holy Land. He goes towards, first off, southward, because he finds himself in confrontations constantly with the people to the south. He goes to the east because he conquers the Persian king and takes over his land. But the coveted land is the land in between. And it's the land where more wars have been fought by all of the major powers of the Middle East. That's where most wars go to. Well, we now come to my first question, or my second question, because my first question is, why do we change animals? My second question is this. Look at verse 9. Out of one of them came forth this little horn, which grew exceedingly southward, eastward, and to the west coveted land. It grew up how high? It grew up to the hosts of heaven. Time out. Were we talking about Antiochus or are we talking about Superman? Who are we talking about? Okay. Now, that's the first time I've ever asked anybody this question, but I choose to ask you now because you're Bible students and you all are interested in what's going on. So he grew up to the hosts of heaven. And it goes on to say, and it threw some of the host and some of the stars to the ground, and he trampled them. Hello. Who did he trample? Did he trample angels? Or are we talking about simply righteous men, priests, if you will? Who's he talking about? He goes on to say after that, it exalted itself even to whom? The master of the host. Now, the word for the master of the host is Zahav. Zahav, Sar Zahav. That character is the heavenly chief. That's what it means. Time out. It exalted itself even up to the exalted chief of staff in God's heaven. Are we talking about a spiritual experience here, or are we talking about a physical experience? What kind of thing are we talking about? Well, I'm not done yet, because it goes on to say, because of it, the daily offerings was removed, and the foundations of his sanctuary. Notice the word his. His sanctuary was thrown down. Okay, time out. Are we talking then about Antiochus shutting off the sanctuary? Now, if we are, then when we go down to verse number 26, now remember, this is the verse we started with. The vision of the nightfall and of the morning, which has been spoken, is true. As for you, obscure the visions that belong to when? Question. What sanctuary is he talking about? Now, Rashi says that we're not talking about Antiochus. We're talking about Titus and his destruction of the second temple. Okay. I want you to hang on to that for a while, because we're going to find out when Rashi said this was all going to happen, when the end would actually be. Because you see, the second temple ended in the 1st century. Rashi's writing from the 9th to the 12th century. That's when all of these scholars are actually writing this commentary that I've been reading for years. But there is no sanctuary now. Is there going to be another sanctuary prior to the sanctuary that they say that is coming from heaven, or that the Messiah is going to build? Are they talking about that one? And if they're talking about that one, time out. That hadn't happened yet. Now look what goes on after that. So he's going to do what? He's going to remove the foundation of his sanctuary was thrown down. Now my Bible has the word his capitalized. Are there capital letters in the Hebrew Bible? No. So it could be a small his, but if it's a large his, then it's talking about God's sanctuary. Does God have a sanctuary right now? Yes, he does. There is a sanctuary in heaven. The one here on earth is not functioning, but the one in heaven is. But for some apparent reason, it's going to quit, and it's going to be thrown down, or at least part of it is. Are you seeing my problem with this book of Daniel? And I don't mean to call it a problem, because what it's trying to do is it's leading me towards understanding the very last days. That's where it's leading me, because that's what Daniel is writing about, is the very last days. That's where we're at. Well, look what it says after that. It will throw truth, Torah, to the ground, and it will achieve and prosper. So there's going to be a period of time when all of this happens. Now, if you're reading the book of Enoch, or if you're reading some of the writings from Chabad, you know that the character they're talking about is called Armilus, Armilus, Armilus. You can take some time to look it up. If you're looking for it in a Christian Bible, he's called Antichrist. He's also referred to as Gog by some of the writers. So the character that we're talking about and the time that we're talking about is the time of the end, and it's about the time of Gog and Magog. That's what this time is all about. But imagine, this vision is clouded. It has truth to it. It's happened before. It happened during the time of Antiochus. It happened during the time of Titus, and it's going to happen again. In Jewish prophecy, oftentimes a prophecy is laid on top of another prophecy. In other words, once done doesn't mean it's done. There's what they call a quantum leap. Quantum. That's a new scientific term for most of us, but it's a term that's been around for hundreds of years. But we've adopted it and changed what it's really meaning. But it goes back to the idea that this is a quantum leap into the future. That's what Daniel 8 is talking about, is something far in the future. Now look at it again from verse number 13. I heard the Holy One speaking. Now we're never going to see this Holy One. We just heard him. That's all we're going to do. Now some people will say that this is Michael. Other people are going to tell us, no, it's not Michael. It's the Metatron. Metatron was the chief angel. He was the head of all angels. And he's the one that's explaining this. Some say Metatron and Michael are the same character. Whatever you want to use, this angel is not going to be seen. But it says, and the Holy One said to the anonymous one who was speaking, so there's an angel talking to an angel. Until when this vision concerning the daily offerings and the mute abomination, allowing the trampling of the Holy One and the hosts, when will this happen? When will it happen? So that's the next question. When's it going to happen? If you're buying into my question and my theory, then you're going to have to say that this is yet future. That's if you're buying into what I'm saying. Or you can follow the ancients, but I think they're going to leave you a couple of years short. Now, let me stop here for a second, and I want to go through Rashi's understanding of time and when all of this was going to happen. He began to measure time, and he went back to, if you go back to the verse number 14, he says, till nightfall and morning, 2,300 what? I'm assuming days, which we could say would be years. So Rashi went back and he began to look at time, and he looked at time beginning with Jacob's arrival in Egypt and the time that they sojourned in Egypt. Now they sojourned for 210 years, so that was the first number he used. The second number he used was from the time of the Exodus until the building of the first temple. That was 480 years. Then he said the life of that first temple, that's 410 years. And then he said the Babylonian captivity, the destruction of the first temple, the Babylonian captivity, that's 70 years. He went to the temple too until the removal of the daily sacrifices, and that was 414 years. Now, from the removal of the daily sacrifices, according to the book of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 11, that would be 1,290 years. So Rashi added all of those up. He came to the number 2874. That's the number of years total so far. Then he went back to this verse with 2,300. Added that to the number, it came out to 4,999. Rashi was expecting the Mashiach to arrive at the year 4,999 from the beginning of time. That's when he was expecting him to come. We are now in 5,700 years, right? So Rashi, when he picked 4,999, he was picking a time that was far ahead of when he lived, because 1499 was actually the year 1602. 1602. So I went and I looked in my guides of what happened in what year, and 1602, nothing happened. There's no Jewish event that was ever recorded that was of any interest or significance. So, not to say that Rashi was wrong or anybody else, but as we go through time and as we go through this, we all have to understand nobody will pick the actual date. I don't care how many pools you've got going and you get in all of them, nobody will know the day and the hour in which it happens. But we will know that we're getting closer. And I think you and I, after watching what's going on in Israel and the Middle East, are thinking we're coming closer. I look to YouTube all the time, and I've seen so many messages from Christian ministers talking about the fact that we're at the end of days using the book of Revelations. I don't use the book of Revelations anymore, but I do use the book of Daniel, and I agree with them. And I use the book of Ezekiel, and I really agree with him. And so as we're looking at this, I want you to understand, I'm not going to give you a date. That's not anything I can possibly even come up close to. Okay. Having said that, go on to verse 15. When I, Daniel, saw the vision, I sought understanding. And then behold, there stood before me the likeness of a man. Now I use the word likeness of a man because there's a group of angels called Ishbaim. They are like men. So he was probably looking at an angel that was standing over the waters. And I heard a human voice in the middle of the ulai, not from that man, but a voice. Now, if you ever read the books of Enoch, you're going to find out that there are oftentimes in there are voices that are going to be heard, but no being anywhere around. I think that's the character that Enoch was picking on when he began to write his book. Now, he wrote his book in the 2nd, 3rd century CE. But as we're going through, obviously, that's not going to help now. It was before the canon, by the way. In fact, the book of Enoch was lost. I don't know if I remember telling you that or not, but the book of Enoch was lost because the Jews said it was unusable because of the fact of where they said the Messiah would be born and when he would be born and all of that other. The Christians took it out because the fact that it didn't match up with Jesus. So both groups dropped it from their Bibles. There was one copy left, and that was in Ethiopia. You see, the Ethiopian Bible includes the book of Enoch. And so the book of Enoch was saved from that, and we have parchments or partial parchments in the Dead Sea Scrolls that also come from the book of Enoch. So we know the book of Enoch is accurate because the Dead Sea Scrolls are literally right on when they cover Isaiah, when they cover all of the Old Testament stories and the prophets. So we have to assume that they can copy correctly the book of Enoch too. So let's go from there. So anyway, as he goes on, he says, I heard a human voice in the middle of the ulai, and he called out and said, Gabriel. So Gabriel is the Ishim. Explain the vision to that man. Now, again, it goes on to say, so he came to where I was standing. And when he came, I was terrified, and I fell on my face down. And he said to me, understand, and he called me the Son of Man. Now, the Son of Man, Ben Adam, is the highest expression for a human that is given in the scriptures. There's only one other character that was called Ben Adam. That was the character called Ezekiel. Ezekiel and Daniel are living in the same time. So I'm assuming many of the messages that Ezekiel was receiving came from the same source, from the same character. It goes on to say that the vision concerns when? What does it say? The end of time. So I'm given a choice to say this book is accurate, but it doesn't go far enough. And that's where I want to leave it at this point. Now, this is my 5th time through, and this is the first time I've said I'm not trusting this for the total end. In fact, I'm using my sanctified imagination, everything that I've read and found from all kinds of sources, and I'm trying to put together my best understanding of what's going on. So you may agree or you may disagree, but it's the best information I can find. If you can find more, I'd appreciate it. So, but anyway, as we go on, here it is. So it concerns the time of the end. Verse 18. And as he spoke to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me and I stood me up in my place. Verse 19. He said, I am ready to inform you what will be after the fury. Now, I assume the fury is the battle of Gog and Magog. That's what I'm assuming it is. Fury here gives, in the Jewish understanding, is a disaster. It's catastrophic. So after this, for at that appointed time will be the end. Again, another point to the fact that we're talking about that Daniel's talking about the end. So another point where we're going to have to say that the end was not with Titus. The end was not with Antiochus. The end is yet future. The two-horned ram that you saw symbolizes the kings of Media and Persia, and the he-goat is the kingdom of Greece. And the large horn that is between the eyes, it's the first king. Well, that would be Alexander the Great. And as for the broken one, in whose place 4 rose, 4 kingdoms will arise from one nation, but lacking its strength, and which is true. This last section is key to where we're going. At the end of their kingdom, when the sinners are annihilated, at the end of their kingdom, the sinners are going to be annihilated. What are we talking about? That's the day of judgment. So now we're definitely in talking about the last days, the end of days, Ketz. A brazen-faced king, some would call it Titus, some would call it Antiochus, others would call it Armilus or Gog. An understander of mysteries, key, an understander of mysteries. One who understands mysteries is a mystic, a Kabbalist, one who studies that which is not easily found. So our character is going to be a mystical character. Now he will arise, his power will grow, but not through his own power. And he will destroy mightily. He will succeed and accomplish and will destroy mighty ones in the nation of holy ones. What's the difference between the mighty ones and the holy ones? Are you finding any questions in here that you hadn't seen before? Now, he goes on to say, because of his cunning and because he will proceed with deceit in his hand, he will grow proud in his heart. He will destroy many in peace, but he will stand up against the master of masters, and he will be broken. Who's the master of masters? God, isn't it? Or the Mashiach. But the question then becomes, which one? That's for another lesson. 26, I've read to you twice already. The vision of nightfall. Okay, I've only been talking for 42 minutes. Excuse my voice. Anybody have any questions about next week's assignment? Next week's assignment is you're going to be able to explain to me Daniel chapter 8. Why do we have 2 different names for our animals? And why does he pick on those two nations? Why is he picking on Greece and why is he picking on Persia? What are they telling us? What are they hinting at? Is it simply about the nation called Greece? Is it simply about the nation called Iran? Or is it about something else all entirely? Okay, I'm done. Anybody have any thoughts?
What is your thought on Rashi's commentary that says that verse 24 is actually, verse 23 is actually speaking that this is Titus, the brazen-faced one. What do you think? How can it not be, or what's your view since you have done a lot of research on this?
The word for brazen one is the word for arrogant.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any other arrogant people that's ever lived on this earth? Like 1938 to
Oh,
1945?
that's true. And who currently resides in Gaza?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Or Iran.
Yeah,
See,
Iran. Yeah.
there's lots of arrogant ones. And Rashi picked on I believe Rashi picked on those two simply because of the fact that he believed that it would end soon. He didn't picture it going 6,000 years. 499 is the end. We're supposedly in the 5,000s, supposed to be going into the Messianic era. So therefore, he ended at about the right time if you use the number 499. So that's the idea. But the character with the brazen face, he was a king, was a leader, but he's not leading by being a military genius at this point in time. What we're saying, he's leading because he does what? He has the power to succeed because why? It's his mouth. He has the ability to deceive everyone. Now we're going to find this character again in Daniel chapter 11, or we're going to find somebody in chapter 11.
So you're
But the,
saying this is potentially not a single character, but a people group or a system.
correct. With a leader at the end.
Yeah, of course.
So in other words, if you want to call it the Illuminati, who are trying to new world order, rearrange everything so that we now become one world again, go back to the days of Babel. But again, in order for that to happen, somebody's going to have a silver tongue in order to convince China that they don't really want to be the number one nation in the world, or Iran, who's dealing with the Islam versus Christianity. We're looking for a character that's going to come out of something, but he's not necessarily going to be what we would normally think of because the nations will believe him. So he's going to be somebody. If you were watching television today, you know that the House finally elected somebody to be the Speaker of the House. Now, if you go back and ask people about him, and now I can't, his name doesn't come to my head. He's from Louisiana and it's his third term as a congressman, very eloquent speaker, um, Bible believer. Can't think of his name. But anyway, he was on nobody's list to be the Speaker of the House. And yet he becomes the Speaker of the House. In other words, he was not anybody's first choice, but yet he becomes. The same thing is going to happen with Armilus. Armilus will rise up from the group, according to the book of Enoch. He will not be somebody that they would recognize, but he will eventually have usurped the power of everybody. He will become what we would call Antichrist. He will become that character, the anti-Messiah, if you will. Mike Johnson. Thank you very much, Ross. Mike Johnson. Couldn't think of his name to save my soul. But I would know, and I have to save my soul by remembering his name. But anyway.